Donald Trump is continuing his effort to reach out to minority voters, visiting a black church in Detroit this weekend and laying out what he calls a new civil rights agenda. In a moment, we'll talk with Dr. Ben Carson, who joined Trump in Detroit, and Congressman Gregory Meeks, a Clinton supporter, about who has the better plan to help minorities. But first, Fox News correspondent Peter Ducey on Trump's stop in Detroit. Peter.
Chris, to get to this inner-city church, the first African-American church he'd ever visited, Donald Trump's motorcade had to pass through a rough part of Detroit. And once inside the Great Faith Ministries, the Republican nominee told the congregation he can make Detroit a city the whole world envies again.
We need a civil rights agenda for our time. The right to live in safety and in peace and to have a really, really great job, a good paying job, and one that you love to go to every morning. And that can happen.
Trump's speech that he said was handwritten was very well received by the several hundred people who heard it, and wasn't just optimistic and forward-thinking, it was reflective.
For centuries, the African American church has been the conscience of our country. So true. It's from the pews and pulpits and Christian teachings of black churches all across this land that the civil rights movement lifted up its soul and lifted up the soul of our nation.
Detroit native Dr. Ben Carson took Trump on a tour of his old neighborhood not far from the church. Before the nominee left town, they met with residents, including the woman who now lives in Carson's old house, and the informal visit fit with the pledge Trump made yesterday to listen and to learn to the people he met here. Chris?
Peter Ducey reporting from Detroit. Peter, thanks for that. We want to turn now to Dr. Ben Carson, who is a top Trump advisor and took the nominee to his hometown of Detroit. Dr. Carson, Trump has been on the campaign trail now for 15 months. This was his first trip to an inner city for a public event with African Americans. First, what took him so long? And secondly, what do you think his trip accomplished?
Well, first of all, I recognize that traditionally the Republican Party has not made an extensive outreach to certain communities, including the African American community, because they've pretty much written that off as Democrat territory. Donald Trump is changing that narrative and is really starting to talk about this in a very serious way. And I've had many discussions with him about it. He becomes very animated during those discussions, and this is a subject about which he cares deeply. And what is going to be accomplished is something that many in the Democrat Party fear, and that is an alternative to, promises that are not kept. And look at the situation that's going on in our inner cities with the school systems. You look at the incarceration rates that are going on, the broken homes, out of wedlock births, the economic situation. This is not good. And of course it doesn't apply to all blacks, but we have a substantial number of blacks living in our inner cities. And if our inner cities are weak and are not prospering, how can the entire nation prosper? And that is really the goal.
But let me pick up on that, Dr. Carson. Trump laid out what he called a civil rights agenda for our time: education, safe streets, good jobs. I want to talk about the first of those. He calls for school choice, but we looked in all of his speeches during this campaign, we looked on his campaign website, and nowhere does he explain what he means by school choice, how it would work, and how he would pay for it.
Well, it is assumed that people know that school choice means you get a choice of your school. You're not necessarily assigned to a school because of where you live, and if that school happens to be dysfunctional, you just suffer the consequences. That is something that we want to change. We want to give people a choice by a voucher system. And it's very interesting that many people in the political arena are against vouchers and school choice, and yet they send their own children to very prestigious private schools, fully recognizing that if you give a person a good education, it doesn't matter what their racial or economic background is, they basically will be able to write their own ticket. This should be a very high priority for us, and it was for those who founded this country. And they talked about the need for an educated and well-informed society, particularly Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson.
But let me pick up on that, because Trump has also called for abolishing the Department of Education, which gives out $1.4 billion a year in what's called Title I funds for schools that are dealing with impoverished students. Here's what Hillary Clinton had to say about Trump and his outreach to African Americans.
It really does take a lot of nerve to ask people he's ignored and mistreated for decades, what do you have to lose? Because the answer is everything.
Dr. Carson, how do you respond to Clinton?
I would simply respond by saying it's really the Democratic Party that has the explaining to do. They've been in charge of our cities for a long time. The city I grew up in, Detroit, was once the most prosperous city in the United States. Some people say in the world. From there, it went to the largest bankruptcy. That was not a coincidence. And we see that in our large cities across the nation under Democratic control. That is a problem. And when that is happening, what Donald Trump is saying, why would you continue down that same pathway? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing, expecting a different result. The result will not be different. Now, he's talking about some real clear things. We've had some in-depth discussions about the $2.1 trillion that are overseas. Repatriating that money with no taxes, with the stipulation that 10% of it has to be used in enterprise zones and to create jobs for people who are unemployed, underemployed, or on welfare. You want to talk about a stimulus? That would be the biggest stimulus since FDR's New Deal, and it wouldn't cost the taxpayers one penny, and it also gets corporate America once again involved in their communities, which they used to be before the government took over and made a mess of it.
Dr. Carson, Trump has a Hispanic advisory council, but after his hardline speech on immigration this week, several members of that council quit. Here's one of them.
It was not a Republican speech. It was not a compassionate speech. I was very disappointed, and I'm not going to be part of that.
Question, do you
know what I would say?
Do you worry that you're being used as a prop for black voters and that supporting Donald Trump will end up hurting your credibility in the black community?
It's not about me. It's a long time ago. It's not about me. It's about our nation. But I would suggest, Chris, go back and look at the 1995 State of the Union address by Bill Clinton and see what he said. He said, illegal aliens are creating big problems for us, and we're going to put a lot more border patrol people on and secure our borders, and we're not going to have people able to work who come in illegally, and we're going to cut off their welfare benefits, and we're going to deport people in record numbers. You know, he says basically the same thing, but when he says it, wow, great standing ovation, this is a great president. And when Trump says it, it's hate speech. What hypocrisy. What incredible hypocrisy.
I've got about a minute left, and I got to ask you one final question, and that is about the fact that the FBI released its files this week into the investigation of Hillary Clinton and her use of a private email system. Your reaction to the facts that were released?
Well, it's very troublesome. You know, she claims not to remember many things. Do you want somebody with inability to remember in the White House? Or do you want somebody who is a prevaricator in the White House? Well, you get a choice. Or do you want to maybe go in a completely different direction altogether? You know, everything is a coincidence. I know it looks bad, but, you know, it's not really that way. And we're really very honest people. And we don't use our office to enrich ourselves. I know it looks that way, and everything points in that direction. But believe us, we're wonderful people. I think at some point people begin to see through that.
Dr. Carson, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you. Thanks for your time on this holiday weekend, sir.
Thank you.